their neighbors. The Dursley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursley had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended that she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were Dursleys, as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think that what the neighbor would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursley knew that the Potter had a small son too, but they had never ever seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dawn grey Tuesday or starry start, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as he was screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny old flutters past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and threw his siren at the walls. "Little tyke," choked Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar: a card-reading map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look window in his office on 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on trains that morning. He didn't see their owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed, as though much as quiver when a cast or slam in the street, nor when two owls swap overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and his eye narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in private drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into this belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were bright and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a ship where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was very busy, rummaging his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put outer, until the only lights left in the whole street were two tiny pink bricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If any looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening now. On the pavement, Dumbledore slipped the put out back inside his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned into a smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather surly-looking woman who was wearing square glass, exactly the shape of the marking the cat had around its eye. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly. You'd be stiff if you had been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating. I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone's celebrating, all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no, even the Muggle have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the dusty, dark living room window. "I heard it. Flops of old shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I bet that was Delalo's digger. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years." "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but there's no reason to lose our heads. People people are being downright careless out on the street in a broad daylight, not even dressed in macaw clothes, swapping rumors. She threw a sharp, sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. A fine thing it would be if, on the very day you know who seems to have disappeared at last, the maker found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore. It certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sabbat lemon? A what? A sabbat lemon. They're a kind of mugger sweet I'm rather fond of. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for sherbet lemons. As I say, even if you know who has gone. My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you know who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking to Sabbath Lemon. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking to Sabbath Lemon, seemed not to notice. It won't get so confusing if we keep saying you know who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. But you are different. Everyone knows you are the only one you know. Oh, all right. Voldemort was frightened up. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had proper I would never have. Only because you are too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new move. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, the owls are nothing to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he did disappear, about what finally stopped him. It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold hard world all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman has she fixed Dumbledore with such a fixing stare as it did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another Sabbath lemon and did not answer. What they are saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumors is that Lily and James Potter that they are dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James, I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Ambrose. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as he went on. That's not all. They are saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they are saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded clumsily. It's true. won't even remember. Can you see how much better off he will be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his clock suddenly, and as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as that? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He does then too. What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorbike fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wide. Long tangents of bushy black hair and bird behind most of his face. He had the hands the size of dusting blade, and his feet in the leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, feeling relief at last. And where did you get the motorbike? Borrow it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully of the motorbike as he spoke. John Sirius Black lent me. I've got him, sir. No problem with it. No, sir. I was almost destroyed, but I got him out on right before the muggers started swarming around. He fell asleep as we flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep. Under a dull object, black hair over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning. That's where, whispered Professor McGonagall. Yes, said Dumbledore. He wouldn't have the scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in useful. I have one myself above my left knee, which is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, keep him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arm and turned toward the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great, saggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very sketchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly, Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. Shh! Hissed Professor McGonagall. You will make the mugger. Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a leg-spotted handkerchief and pouring his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lady and James dead, and poor little Harry off the life with muggers. Yes, it's all very sad. One's one hand closed on the letter beside him and he slept on. Not knowing he was better, not knowing he was famous,